Okay, so in the first video, we walked through the very first part of the game class where we described all of the variables, the static variables that belong to the class and the non-static variables that belong to the instance of the class. And we did not explain this public static game G. I'll explain that in a later video. We explained the main method. And then in the second video, we went through the constructor, which initialized all of the instance data for the game class. Now, below the constructor is a method called dicePlaced. The player, when it places dice, is going to then call this method, and it's going to do some bookkeeping inside of the game each time the dice get placed. I'm going to come back to that method. Right now, I would like to explain the paint method. The paint method is what draws stuff on the screen. And so every time repaint is called, or if the window is moved, or if it was resizable, if it was resized, or when it first opens up, there are a lot of different times when paint gets called. But whenever the application, the J-frame, needs to draw itself on the screen, paint gets called and it receives a graphics object. We're a little bit familiar with this, but I'm going to go ahead and walk through that in this video. Anyhow, so in the very first part of it, we just set the color to white and then fill rectangle 0, 0 with height. This just clears the background. It just fills a white background on the image. So every time we repaint, we clear the background. That's mostly important for the labels, because as I change the labels or the text that's on the screen, I don't want different pieces of text to just overlap each other. So I just wipe the slate clean in the beginning. And then for each dice D that's contained in my dice, remember my dice is an array of 5 dice. And so what this is going to do is just going to go one by one through each of the dice and tell it to paint itself. It's calling the paint method of the dice, and passing it the graphics object that is able to paint in the J-frame. So that'll draw the dice on the screen. Each die is then going to draw itself. And it draws the background. And the background is going to draw either the rules of the game in the very beginning, or once they've selected the number of players, it's going to then draw the scorecard, which is just an image. It's just displaying an image on the screen. And we'll look at that code in a minute. G.setColor black. Now up here we did cleared background to white, and now I'm going to draw a bunch of text, and I want to draw black text on the white background. If roll count is 0, it's only 0 at the very beginning of the game. From then on, it's going to be 1, 2, or 3, depending on whether it is the first, second, or third roll of the player. So if it's the very beginning of the game, we're just going to draw a piece of text that tells the person playing the game to select the number of players. And that's the X and Y location of that piece of text. This is just prompting the user of the game, telling them what they're supposed to do. Otherwise, if the roll count is less than 3, remember it's an else. So if the roll count is 0, it won't draw this. But if it is less than 3, meaning it's a 1, 2, or 3, or 1 or 2, not 3, then it's going to say player, and then whose turn plus 1. So if it's player 0's turn, actually the person who stored at index 0, we're going to display a 1, because it's not nice to call him player 0. We're going to say it's player 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. That's the way it's displayed on the screen, but it's really in our code at index 0. So player 1 is going to be stored at index 0. Player 2 is going to be stored at index 1, and so that's what this little plus 1 is. And so this is just identifying the player, and then it says click the dice to re-roll. So that's essentially telling them to select which dice he wants to roll again. And then it says then press the roll button. So if he's rolled once or twice, he's got to select dice to re-roll and then click the roll button. And so this puts those labels in the appropriate spots on the screen. If the roll count is equal to 1, it's just going to say, hey, you've rolled once. If the roll count is equal to 2, it's just going to say, hey, you've rolled twice. If the roll count is equal to 3, it says, hey, you've rolled thrice. And in this case, since roll count is not less than 3, it's not going to display this, hey, click the dice and then the roll button. Instead, it's going to say, click scorecard location, saying, hey, you've rolled your 3 times. Now you need to click somewhere on the scorecard to place your dice and have them scored. And then it goes through all of the players and tells them to paint. The players essentially have scores for each category. And this is just telling the player to, hey, draw your score for your category in the appropriate location on the scorecard. And so that's what the players are going to do. So this is just a loop. And I could have used a for each loop like I did up at the beginning. So I used a for each loop up here for the dice, and then I used a regular for loop down here for the players. That's a matter of personal preference. This code, these 3 lines of code, are going to do exactly the same as if I had typed for each player P that's contained in, that's a colon, not a semicolon, that's contained in all players P dot paint using graphics object G. Okay? So this 1 line of code does exactly the same thing as these 3 lines of code. So why would a person use a regular for loop? Well, you'll notice that I don't have access to the index, right? So there are times when I would like to, while I'm going through my loop, know what index I'm at. Sometimes it matters. In a for each loop, I don't have access to that information. The other thing that I cannot do in a for each loop is I cannot modify the array of all players. I can tell the players to do things, but I cannot modify the array. I can't add players to it. I can't remove players from it. If I try to modify the array in the for each loop, it would cause a problem. But in a regular for loop, I can. So a regular for loop is a little more powerful than a for each loop, but a for each loop is a little easier to write. I'm going to leave this alone. I just want you to see an example of each. G.setColor new color. Now, up here, the color class has a public static variable of type color that is a predefined color for white. It also has a predefined color for black. But sometimes, you know, it's just got this short list of predefined colors. Sometimes I want to use a color that's not in the list. I can do that by creating a new instance of the color class. And I do that by calling the constructor and then passing it some numbers. Now, there are several different ways to do it. I can pass it a float, which is a floating point decimal. I type in the number and then an F. Without the F, it's a double. It's a double precision number. And the way they created the constructor, it expects floats. I could also pass it an int. If I pass it an int, the value has to be between 0 and 255. If I pass it a float, the number has to be between 0 and 1. The first is the red value, the second is the green value, the third is the blue value, and the fourth is an alpha value. It's transparency. So by making red, green, and blue all 0.5, I get a gray. It's halfway between white and black. And by making the alpha value 0.5, that means it's a transparent gray. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to fill a rectangle in the appropriate column depending on whose turn it is. So that it's just a graphical way of displaying which player, whose turn it is, okay? Instead of just player whatever, it shows on the scorecard whose player it is with a nice transparent gray rectangle. So if the number of players is greater than 0, remember we start it out at 0 at the very beginning of the game. I don't want those rectangles to display on top of the instructions at the very beginning. I just want it them to display after they've picked the checkboxes and set the number of players. And so number of players starts out at 0. As soon as they click a checkbox, it'll be greater than 0. And then it'll start drawing the rectangles in the appropriate spot depending on whose turn it is. So fill rect gives me a rectangle. I've got an X value, a Y value, a width, and a height. And then I've got an upper section and a lower section on my scorecard, and so I draw a rectangle in the upper and lower sections. And then if the game is over, that starts out at false, eventually it'll become true. I just want to draw a great big word game over. And it's going to be the same transparent gray as my rectangles. It's just going to be over the top of the screen. So the graphics object has a font. And so whenever we draw string, it'll draw that piece of text in its own current font. I want to derive some new font. So I'm going to get the font that's already in the graphics object. And then once I have it, every font has a derive font method which creates a new font that's of a different size. I want this to be great big, so I use 130. And this is a float. It has to be a float. 130 pixels high. Okay, that's going to be the size of my new font. So I get the current font. I derive a new great big font from it. I store it in the variable f, and then I say g.setFont, this new great big font, and then I'm going to draw the text game over. It's all done. And this is the x and y location. So I pass it a string literal and the x and y location. So that's the paint method. In the next video, part 4, we'll describe the action performed and item state changed. I'll describe those methods. That should be the last video for the game class. The two most complicated classes are game and player. And so, believe it or not, we're halfway through the videos. You will be implementing some methods in player.